It was a time of marvels, powerful railroads, mighty bridges, giant factories, telegraphs, telephones, and newspapers for a penny that linked and shrank the world. And towering above them were the cities, symbols of an age. The Industrial Revolution, this time on the Western tradition. In 1848, a young Prussian exile living in Brussels wrote this hymn to the bourgeoisie. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has created more massive and colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing whole continents for cultivation, making rivers navigable, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century could have told that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? The passage is from the Communist Manifesto, and its writer, of course, was Karl Marx, who was very impressed by material things. And when Marx wrote this, he wrote it together with his friend Friedrich Engels, who was quieter and less dramatic, hence more liable to be forgotten than Marx. So when Marx and Engels wrote this, the 19th century was just beginning to reveal its prodigies that we usually lump together as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is usually related to advances in textile production after it became mechanized in 18th century England. But the machinery still turned with water power. In 1848, when the Communist Manifesto came out, most of the textile works on the continent were still dependent on the streams that made them run. Even in England, which was the great pioneer of Industrial Revolution, 1 mill in 5 had no steam engine. But the effect on people's lives and on society as a whole was already dramatic. In a later show, I shall be talking about the dark side of the Industrial Revolution, the misery and suffering it brought to millions. Just after 1800, for example, William Blake, the visionary English poet who was the son of a London hosier, attacked the dark, satanic mills that defiled England's green and pleasant land. But within a generation of Blake's poem, these dark satanic workshops were also turning out ginghams and calicos and other stuff that even working women could afford to buy. So now, poor girls who had turned out for centuries dressed in drab homespun began to look, as a Frenchman was going to put it in the late 40s, like a garden full of flowers. And it wasn't just the girls. For thousands of years, poor people had worn second-hand clothes, hand-me-downs, hard, durable stuff of which they would have one suit or one dress in a lifetime, at most two. In the 19th century, however, they were going to be offered ready-mades at accessible prices. Garments sewn on the new mechanical sewing machines that a New Yorker, Isaac Singer, patented in 1851. And by the end of the century, they might be able to buy their own sewing machine and make their own garments and those of their family, no longer by needle and thread, but by stitching them mechanically in a fraction of the time. So Marx wasn't alone in feeling the revolutionary character and the results and the potential of industrialism. Industrialism itself being a word coined in the 1820s. And he wasn't the only one to take present achievements as indications of future growth. He was right to be impressed, and he was right to expect more of the future. There were only about 16,000 miles of railroad track in Europe when Marx published his Communist Manifesto. But if you put them together with the tunnels, the railway bridges, the stations and workshops and sheds that were part of the system, they already represented more stone and metal than all the monuments of antiquity, including the pyramids. By the First World War, there would be over 220,000 miles of rail running across Europe, and if you count the subways and the drains and the sewers that made the cities work, the aqueducts, as great as anything the Romans built, the thousands of miles of road and canal and tunnel, and bridges grander and more imaginative than any ever built before, and the tens of thousands of miles of telegraph line, not to mention the poles that line the landscape in a completely new way. If you count all this, you have a mass of public works vaster than anything humanity ever produced. One English historian reckons that the 19th century also produced more stonework in the Gothic style than the Middle Ages. It certainly produced more classical buildings than the Classical Age ever did. But the greatest advances of the Industrial Revolution were in the realm of transport and communications. When the 19th century opened, Napoleon's armies didn't move much faster than those of Julius Caesar. When the century closed, you could cross all of Europe in 3 or 4 days by rail, and everybody knew you could go around the world in 80 days, as Phineas Fogg had done in Jules Verne's novel of 1873. And you could do all this in the new comfort of railway cars, dining cars, even sleeping cars. There were other extraordinary changes as well. For the first time, news was consistently moving faster than people. In ancient times, you could send a message by carrier pigeon, and you could hope that the pigeon didn't get diverted along the way or eaten. In the time of the Three Musketeers, you could send a message by courier who might cover as much as 60 miles a day, as long as he wasn't held up by bad weather or by robbers. By the time of the French Revolution, you could send a message by semaphore telegraph, provided the message was simple and the weather was clear. But by the 1870s, a telegram could reach around the world in a few hours, and by 1900, radio messages could leap over the oceans in a flash. The telephone, which people took for a trick in the 1870s, had 2.5 million European subscribers by 1900. And rotary presses were turning out daily and weekly papers in increasing numbers, making news increasingly available. Even news itself was a 19th century notion, suggesting a world attuned to novelty rather than routine. Daily newspapers existed in the 18th century, but they cost a lot of money, and practically speaking, they were reserved for the well-off. It wasn't until the introduction of the rotary press in the mid-19th century that all this changed. The London Times, for example, printed 5,000 copies a day in 1815 and sold them for 7 pence. 40 years later, it sold 50,000 copies a day at 5 pence. In 1815, it took 4 days before the Battle of Waterloo was reported in London. But after 1851, when an underwater cable linked Dover to Calais, and after 1866, when it linked England to America, news took only a matter of hours. And there were also newspapers selling for a penny only, which made news available to all and raised circulation first into the hundreds of thousands, eventually by the 90s, the 1890s, into the millions. The influence and the power of the press was a completely unexpected phenomenon. It was in 1828 that an article in a Scottish magazine declared that the gallery where reporters sat listening to parliamentary debates had become a fourth estate of the realm. So now, what today we call the media were added to the old regime vocabulary of clergy, nobles, and third estate. Now here was a completely new way of addressing the people, of affecting the masses, and it proved so effective that a number of revolutions, like the Revolution of 1830, and a number of major political crises like the Dreyfus affair in France in the 1890s could be directly attributed to the press, which first whipped up public concern and inflamed it, then claimed to reflect what it had in fact created. Mass circulation papers, where the real profits are, were sold by sensationalism and muckraking. So that's what a lot of papers looked for, and their revelations could shake governments as well as individuals. They could bankrupt a bank, they could topple a government, they could help to start a war, which happened when the French press whipped up popular feeling against the Prussians in 1870, or the Hearst press helped to start the Spanish-American War in 1898.
But apart from these spectacular effects, the simple fact that newspapers brought a mass of world news to the door each morning, news selected chiefly for its lurid appeal, this made the world seem a busy, crowded place full mostly of crisis and crime. Of course, there's crime in every society, there's violence in every age, and our age is no more criminal, no more violent or corrupt than others, though you might not believe it. If anything, our age is less so. But we know more about exceptional activities because ordinary activities are not news. There is no story in a wife loving her husband or a father loving his children. It's only when they beat each other that it becomes interesting, and this is what is news. So we know more about these activities. We read and hear all the time about things that traditional societies knew about only if they happened next door or if they were sufficiently spectacular. So what was ignored until the 1800s? And what remained vague or diffuse until then became increasingly real and personalized thereafter.
It became even more real when you could see a picture of it. In the 19th century, it wasn't just newsprint that became affordable and accessible, pictures did too. The lithographic process developed after 1798, photography developed after 1839, and then photolithography started a tide of prints and etchings that produced graphic, visible witness of wonders and horrors, horrors like Goya's Horrors of War series, that came home more forcefully when you could see them. They also allowed people of modest means to put pictures on the wall or on the mantelpiece, portraits, caricatures, reproductions of art, and this filled humble homes with color. It gave shape and concreteness to news events. It put a face on public figures that most people had never seen before. And it also allowed lovers or relatives to send each other their likeness or a picture postcard from faraway places. And what all this did was to accentuate the chief characteristic of the age, which was novelty and constant change. All ages see change. All ages are times of transition. Eve probably told Adam that they lived in a time of transition. But the 19th century brought this home more forcefully than any age had before, and the news industry documented, illustrated the process, so you couldn't escape from it. All these achievements were spectacular, but they also affected people's lives in unspectacular ways. The communications revolution was as perceptible as the textile revolution. Ordinary people could send telegrams now. They could walk into a post office and send a money order safely. They could afford to buy a stamp and send a letter or a postal package. And ordinary people could take a train, where half a century before they would have walked, or else stayed home. In 1830, less than 20,000 people a year crossed the Atlantic to America. By the 1850s, there were faster clipper ships that could reach Boston from Liverpool in only 12 days. And then came steamships, which were a lot more reliable, until by the end of the century, 1 million people crossed the Atlantic every year. The agricultural revolution was less spectacular, but then you could not have had an industrial revolution without it. In the age of industrialization, the greatest industry was still agriculture. And agriculture was revolutionized so that eventually fewer men and women were able to feed a lot more people. In 1800, 3/4 of the population of Europe were engaged in growing food. More than 3/4 of the food of ordinary people consisted of potatoes and bread. By 1900, only half the population of Europe was growing food, and Europeans were eating more vegetables, more meat, more fruit than ever before. But it was a long haul.
Through all of recorded history until just the other day, Europe had lived on the verge of famine, or at least on the verge of hunger, as many people still do in non-industrialized nations. You can't control the weather. You can't control the harvests until the 19th century. Until that time, food shortages were par for the course. Famine was part of the experience of every generation in Europe. And famine didn't mean missing a meal. It meant people eating grass, or earth, or tree bark, or sometimes their own hands, or falling dead in the streets or in country ditches.
Although scenes like this one had become rare in Europe by 1800, there were several serious famines in the years just after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, in the early 30s, and most dramatically in the late 1840s, when famine cut Ireland's population by 20%. After the mid-19th century, Western Europe would never know such peacetime catastrophes again. This was partly because ships and rail could now move grain faster and more efficiently to where it was needed, and partly because farmers had learned how to produce larger surpluses. And Europe needed ever larger surpluses because more people lived in cities and fewer people worked the land. In 1800, about 10% of Europeans lived in cities. By 1900, about 40% of them lived there and someone had to feed them. Some of the surplus food came from outside Europe, from North America, from South America, from Australia, which, remember, were still, in terms of economics and population, extensions of Europe. By the end of the 19th century, about 1/10 of international trade was in cereals. King corn was overtaking King cotton. But most of the extra food was produced in Europe itself, a lot of it in the most advanced industrial countries. In fact, it was Britain's agricultural revolution of the 18th century that led to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th. Industrialized Britain produced more food and fed its exploited masses better than Russia, which was totally agricultural. This was achieved by putting more land under the plow, by rationalizing production, by using better crop rotation, by using more fertilizer, and by using better tools. First, the scythe instead of the sickle. In due course, machinery like harvesters and threshers. By 1914, 2.5 times as many people lived in Europe as a century before, and they were better fed by a vastly smaller proportion of the population. Of course, more land under the plow also meant that agriculture probably ruined more of the environment than industry did, cutting down forests, affecting the water tables all over Europe. If you set this aside, the agricultural revolution brought a new prosperity to all the land. By the end of the 19th century, there were fewer peasants, there were more farmers. There were fewer people living on the land, but those who made their living from the land farmed better and lived better. They had better homes, they had more and better furniture. They could afford to show off their regional costumes, which were less historical revivals than modern status symbols. And they could go to the market or to the fair on better roads.
But the most dramatic changes took place not in the country, but in town. There, the novelty lay in the appearance of the industrial city, and especially the big city. In 1800, there were 17 cities in Europe with a population over 100,000 people. By 1900, there were 100 such cities. 31 million people lived in them, and a lot more passed through, sometimes just to see them. In 1850, tourists went to Manchester or Liverpool the way we go to see Disneyland today, or Hiroshima, because they were extraordinary, fascinating, or terrifying examples of the possibilities of the age, of our dreams, of our nightmares. Cities, of course, are the home of civilization. From the ancient world, they have been so. And even the word civilization proves it. Civic, civil, civility, civilization. They all refer to what a citizen is or should be, the member of an urban community. And an urbanite is described as urbane, courteous, elegant, refined. Few were so really, few are so now. But the urbanites are by definition superior to the rustic countrymen who get all the negative descriptions: boor, yokel, bumpkin, clodhopper, and so on and so on. As I said, this was always so, but in the modern world, in the world made and remade by the Industrial Revolution, it was more so, with profound implications for all of us, as we shall see in our next program.
For the first time, there was light. New shops, new goods, new pleasures, wide thoroughfares. But there were also chimneys belching smoke, factories fouling air and water, and gunboat diplomacy making the world safe for Europe. The industrial world, this time on the Western tradition.
Last time we ended with the rise of the big city during the Industrial Revolution. Cities have always been the centers of civilization, of course, but in the 19th century this was more so. They became the shop windows of the modern world. And even the term shop window was something that you couldn't have used before the late 18th century and that you wouldn't be very likely to use before the 19th century, because there were no shop windows. A French girl who visited London on the eve of the French Revolution was fascinated to find that there were windows in front of shops through which she could see the goods on sale. And she spoke of this as a cunning device. And then a few years later, in 1807, a Londoner refers to window displays as a very recent refinement. And he adds that glass windows were seldom used in shops before the present reign. Now think of this next time you go window shopping, another 19th century innovation.
Most shops, however, remained what they had always been, and what they still are in some third world countries today: holes in the wall, with the goods in front, the workshop at the back, the kitchen and family quarters either in the back or on the floor above, no windows, but wooden shutters that the owner takes down in the morning and puts up at night. In all but the major cities, goods were bought either from stalls in the open market or from itinerant peddlers with a pack or a cart, or from some traveling salesman. In England, a salesman was known as the tallyman because he was illiterate and kept his customers' accounts by a tally of notches on a stick. Around 1800, Jane Austen, the novelist, whose father was a country clergyman, was buying material for her dresses and her stockings from just such an itinerant draper. And note that most people had to make their dresses at home, and their stockings too, until the power knitting frame for stockings was introduced in the 1840s and the sewing machine in the 1850s. While such innovations would make sweatshops like this one possible, they also produced cheap ready-mades that ordinary people could buy from shops to wear. But in the late 18th century, shops as we know them were exceptional, nor were the few that existed in cities very attractive. For one thing, they were dark. There were few windows because glass was rare and expensive, and plate glass for large windows was almost non-existent. The middle classes only got clear window glass in any quantity as the 18th century ended, but with this came the beginning of a revolution in indoor lighting, which would continue in the 19th century with the introduction of gaslight.
Although we take a lighted interior for granted, it was never so until the day before yesterday. It took artificial light to change the age-old pattern of the day that had made thousands of generations stop work and go to bed when it got dark. Our control of natural phenomena like light and dark is very recent indeed. It's less than 200 years old for a few privileged people. It's less than 100 years old for most.
It was still rare through most of the 19th century, but it was tremendously exciting. for the first time, you could sit and read or knit under a lamp after dark. And you could also go out at night into streets which were just beginning to be lit, so you didn't need a torch or a lantern to see your way about, and you didn't have to depend on the moon. On the other hand, the streets, even in big cities like London and Paris, were mostly ill-paved, full of potholes, mud, and dust, so you might have stayed indoors after all. Until the latter part of the 19th century, there were hardly any sidewalks. Pedestrians risked being run over by traffic, or getting absolutely filthy when they took a walk, so there was little strolling for pleasure. The wealthy carriage trade went in carriages not just because they could afford it, but because any other course was dangerous for skirts or trousers or even life and limb. Consequently, shopkeepers in the bigger cities developed enclosed galleries and arcades where you could stroll and window shop, safe from traffic and weather. And then they developed bazaars where different traders could concentrate their stalls under one roof until finally about mid-century the first department stores appeared, the biggest of which were going to become monumental showplaces and symbols of the new consumer economy.
It's fashionable nowadays to disparage the consumer economy, and it's true that it has gone to exaggerated and wasteful lengths. But I would rather have too much than too little. And I would rather have a majority of the population with access to consumption than just a tiny minority, as had been the case throughout history. Until the 19th century's mass production, bulk buying, economies of scale encouraged mass consumption and created the low prices, the discounts, the sales that gave a lot of people access to goods and comforts and the courteous treatment, incidentally, that only very few enjoyed until that time. Of course, there were still millions who couldn't afford these goods. There are still millions today. But for the first time, there were millions now who could afford them, not just a few thousands as before. And that was a dramatic change.
All of this started in England, which Napoleon had once denounced as a nation of shopkeepers. The English interest in commerce and exchange led to better streets for goods and customers to move on, like Regent Street in London, which was praised in the 1830s and 40s for its spaciousness and grandeur. After mid-century, wide new thoroughfares could be found in Paris and in other cities as well, not only because they made traffic and shopping easier, but also because they allowed more air, more breathing room in general. They were lined with trees, with benches, with lamps, and increasingly with that novel invention, public lavatories. There were also new parks built all over Europe, in imitation of London's famous Hyde Park, which was a royal garden newly opened to the public, and of the gardens of the Royal Palace of the Tuileries in Paris, also open to the public, another symbol of what was happening everywhere. Facilities and pleasures hitherto open only to the very few were being made available to the many, and the many were eager to join in. The modern city was a great display, a continuous fair, exciting, impressive, entertaining in itself. The city was also becoming safer and more comfortable. Regular police forces appeared in the 1830s,
And there were public baths, drinking fountains, and standpipes for water. And there were public wash houses, where the poor could wash the linen of the rich, and sometimes even their own. The poor, like the rich, could also visit museums now and exhibitions, which the 19th century made public and free to all. In one of Zola's novels, The Dram Shop, a working-class couple in the 1860s celebrate their wedding by going to the Louvre Museum with a whole wedding party. Very soon, in fact, art was going to spill over into the street. Lithography was used by businesses to sell sardines, or dresses, or cigarettes, or advertise entertainments. And city streets blossomed with posters which represented some of the most exciting artwork of the time. They exposed ordinary people to the avant-garde art of the day. They got them acclimated to a new pictorial shorthand that was just beginning to take over. And the 19th century was also the age of public transport. As streets were broadened and straightened, tramways appeared. Streetcars that were pulled by horses along rails until they were electrified in the latter part of the century. There were omnibuses too, pulled by horses until the appearance of the internal combustion engine at the turn of the century. Not to mention trains that made the suburbs and the countryside a short ride away, and sometimes even the seaside, making it accessible to city folk of pretty modest means. Indeed, the second half of the 19th century was for many the age of Sundays in the country, of family picnics by a river or in a field, taking your girl out rowing, of a new kind of relaxation that the Impressionists begin to paint in the 1860s. A whole new population of artisans, clerks, shop assistants were able to enjoy nature and fresh air as never before.
So what you had was a democratization of goods and services and facilities, including leisure and nature and fresh air. And people needed more leisure and more fresh air because the modern city, which offered them a lot of new things, also took away some of the old things.
Just as you could see a medieval city from far away because of its church spires, you could see the 19th century industrial town because of its chimneys belching smoke and the smog that hung over it. Dickens produced a graphically disgusting picture of this in Hard Times, where Manchester becomes Coketown, which he describes as a blur of soot and smoke, a dark, formless, stifling jumble under what another Englishman, John Ruskin, calls the storm cloud of the 19th century. And you could smell it too. Not just the smell of coal and machine oil, but the refuse. At mid-19th century, Parliament had to suspend its sittings because the Thames stank so badly. And so did a lot of industry, gin works, dye works, gas works, chemical works, and so on. But the most characteristic smell was coal dust and smoke. The Industrial Revolution ran on coal, the 19th century was fueled by it. Even at the end of the century, when people were already beginning to use electricity and gasoline-driven engines, 95% of commercial energy was generated by coke and coal, and most fireplaces were heated by it, however badly and inefficiently. England was the most coal-driven country, because England had coal fields that were within easy reach of water transport on the Clyde, on the Tyne, and in Wales. Newcastle on the Tyne was so identified with coal that carrying coals to Newcastle became a proverbial metaphor, like shipping beer to Milwaukee. Even the railways and tramways that marked the century really began as rails laid down to carry carts of coal, pushed by workers or pulled by horses from the pithead to the docks. It was a Tyneside man, George Stephenson, who first put wheels on a steam boiler around 1815 to haul the coal wagons along the rails, and it was Stephenson who adapted this thing he called a locomotive to pull the first passenger railway train in 1825 at the terrifying speed of 15 miles an hour.
The more industry expanded, of course, the more the coal fields grew and the more industry clustered around them. In northwest England, in Belgium, in Lorraine, in the Ruhr, in South Wales, here was Europe's industrial frontier. And you can compare its attraction for immigrants to what was going on in America. In the 30 years before 1914, the rate of immigration into South Wales was not very different from that into the United States. And there were more Poles who moved into the Ruhr Valley in Germany than there were Poles going to Chicago. Where there was coal, there was industry and jobs, however grinding and however ill-paid.
Coal output soared in the 19th century, doubling every 20 years. By 1913, there was 30 times as much coal going up in smoke as there had been in 1820, which made industrial Europe and America smoky and smelly and dark. It produced the London fog that you read about in Dickens or see in films about Sherlock Holmes or Jack the Ripper, and it produced a lot of bad throats, burning eyes, and bronchitis. Most of the coal went to produce the iron and steel, which were the raw material of 19th century machines, tools, bridges, and armaments. And it went to produce the steam that turned the engines and ran the steamships. By the end of the 19th century, 3/4 of the steam engines in the world were in Britain. But it wasn't just industrialists who were excited by all this. Artists were equally excited by what was going on. Turner painted rain, steam, and speed. The Impressionists painted the trains with their plumes of smoke, the clouds of steam rising out of railway yards. And less well-known painters painted forges and factories and tunnels and bridges. But it was the railway station above all that was the symbol of triumphant technology in the 19th century. In a monumental age fond of showing off, the railway station was the very emblem of power, more grand, more monumental, even than a bank. In the 1860s, Walt Whitman sang the shapes of the new age. Shapes of factories, arsenals, foundries, markets. Shapes of the two-threaded track of railroads. Shapes of the sleepers of bridges, vast frameworks, girders, arches. Whitman's lines also bring to mind grand structures like the Crystal Palace, engineered in 1851 to house all the London exhibition of that year in one building of glass and iron. or the great shed of the Saint-Lazare railway station in Paris that Monet liked to paint, or the Eiffel Tower built in 1889 to mark the first century of the French Revolution. But Whitman himself was probably thinking of the Brooklyn Bridge, designed in 1867. For a long time, the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge were the tallest structures in New York. And according to the art historian Kenneth Clark, all of modern heroic New York started with the Brooklyn Bridge. And some of the most beautiful and massive shapes that Whitman didn't mention were to be found on water. Tonnage and speed kept increasing because larger, longer ships were faster and more comfortable to sail on. This is the Great Eastern, under construction in England in 1857, the largest ship of its day. Naval vessels were also being perfected. The steel-plated dreadnoughts were bigger and heavier. New destroyers were faster. The submarines developed by the South in the American Civil War were invisible, at least when they submerged. By the end of the century, the new warships burnt not coal but oil, which was lighter, more efficient, and had the special advantage of being less visible from far away, which made naval warfare even deadlier. It was the oil needs of Western war fleets that would eventually usher in the age of oil diplomacy, but it was the fleets themselves, whether they ran on coal or oil, that made possible the age of gunboat diplomacy. Which simply means if you don't like what some small country does, you send a warship around to intimidate it, as countries, including the United States, have done ever since. The warship of the late 19th century was as much the symbol of the Industrial Revolution as the textile mill or the coal mine. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering. It burned the coal, later the oil that fueled the industry. It was plated first with iron, then with steel, which was yet another innovation of the 19th century, without which we wouldn't have either dreadnoughts or skyscrapers. The warship's guns could locate and hit targets many miles away while racing through the sea. It protected and advanced European trade. It made sure that goods went out from the producers to the consumers, and that the raw materials came in from every part of the world. And it impressed the lesser breeds without the law and kept them in their place, which of course was now firmly under the sway of Europe.
It was shipping that linked the economic core of the 19th century with the periphery. And it was shipping that provided a link between Europe and its dependencies. But it was the gunboat that symbolized the fact that Europe ruled the world economically, politically, militarily. Nonetheless, as we have seen again and again, no power goes unchallenged. In our next program, we'll leave behind the achievements of the 19th century, and we shall look at some of its conflicts. Until then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.